Hi everyone, thank you for attending this week's webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week's topic is Good Guy ListBox. This is essentially a repeat of a session I did at the Xojo Developer Conference a couple months ago. Got a couple new extra tidbits that have been added since then, so if you actually sat through that session at the conference, you'll see a thing or two here that wasn't done at the conference. So before we get started, essentially what I'm going to be going through is I have 12 ListBox examples that I want to try and get through real quick just to show you how they work, very briefly look at the code. But the examples are available right now, so you are welcome to go ahead and grab them. Normally I don't put examples up until after the webinar, but if you head on over to the documentation wiki here at this URL, you can grab the complete package of ListBox examples, so you can have that handy if you want to have them to play with immediately after the webinar or whatnot, or if you want to have them open in another window while you're watching what I'm doing. I don't know, whatever works for you, but they are available immediately, so you can go ahead and grab them. Want to also remind people to feel free and ask questions as I'm going through these. Some of these ListBox things might not exactly look like ListBoxes, so you might have some questions. Feel free to ask them at any time. The questions appear on my other screen, so I can address them when appropriate. So before I dive right in, I am going to also go back to the documentation here and just bring up the ListBox page so you can see how lengthy it is. This particular class is probably the largest class that you have available to you for desktop apps. We'll also talk about the web one too at the end. But there are, I think when I counted these, 37 event handlers available to you, 82 properties, and 31 methods. So there's obviously a lot of stuff on here. And so that means it can do quite a bit of things. It also means that it can be a little bit overwhelming to jump into right from scratch, which is what makes, I think, examples so great when it comes to the ListBox, is you can, kind of pick and choose pieces to help you build what it is you're trying to create. But definitely it is worth spending some time here in the language reference section for the ListBox and studying all the material that's in here. It can help you create some pretty slick stuff. So to start with, I'm going to open up here. Let me just switch to my Finder window and get lined up with the order I want to show these in. All right, so the first one I want to show here is the main ListBox example. This one actually comes with Xojo and kind of covers most of the features of the ListBox, so you can see how it might be used. So I'm just going to run this here. And you can see you get a window here, and there's two different types of list boxes you'll be able to work with, the standard type and then a hierarchical. And this shows off some of the features that you have. So there's different columns with different types of information that are displayed. You can see as I'm moving the mouse cursor around, the coordinates are updating automatically. I can click on individual rows. What is clicked gets selected. You should be able to see on your displays there's some alternate row highlighting. There's a lighter color here, and then white, and then a background. And you can turn that on and off with the little checkbox up here. I can grab on a row and I can drag it around to reorder it. I can drag it off the list box right up to a label up here that's set up to accept drags and drops. And you'll notice when I get right to it, the text changes. And if I let go, it gets the contents of whatever happened to be in column one. The second column that's here contains numbers. Now, normally, if you use the built-in sorting in a list box, it's sorting using text, so things won't necessarily sort numbers in the way you expect. So 68 here would probably appear after 529, but because this has code in the compare rows event handler, it's able to compare these as if they are actual numbers and sort them the way you would expect. This column here has what is called an editable cell, so I can click in it and I can actually edit the text that's in the cell. You can see I can type here. I can press return. You can get an event that tells you what the text is, so you can do something with it. And this is set up so that whenever the cell is clicked, it immediately goes into edit mode, but you have control over that sort of thing. This particular cell column here is simulating a drop-down menu or pop-up menu. You can see when I click in it, I get a little pop-up menu here with some values, and I can select a particular color, and that goes to the next column and actually uses the graphics ability that's built into the list box to actually draw a box in that color, a little rounded box actually. So you can see that's showing you a little bit how you might use graphics to display something within a cell of a list box. And then lastly, you can have an actual checkbox within a list box column. So this is quite a bit of code that in the various event handlers that shows you how to do this. We'll take a brief look at that in a moment. And the other thing that's on here is an example of a hierarchical or a tree view type list box where you can see how children are added to a parent. And you can add new items or new folders, that sort of thing. It doesn't do all the features of the standard example here, but it's mostly just focusing on the ability to have different levels. So this is kind of a high-level view of some of the things that a list box can do, so you can get a feel for that. So if we go back to Xojo, you can see down here, clicking on the standard list box, a lot of the event handlers are listed here and are implemented to do certain things. There's code in the action event handler to capture any editing that was done and get the text of the field, to get whether checkboxes were clicked and stuff like that. Paint code for drawing things. In particular, that pop-up menu, when you select the color, it's drawn in this event handler. Code in the double-clicked event. So certainly play around with this and see how it works, so you can use this as kind of guidance for when you're starting to work with the list box. Now let's move on to some specific examples that show you things you can do with a list box once you have a good grasp of all the event handlers and properties and whatnot. So the first one we're going to look at here is an icon grid. So we'll just run this here. All right, so you can see we got a little window here with a bunch of icons and some text appearing underneath. It doesn't actually look much like a list box when you look at it at first glance. I can click on the individual items. They're highlighted, as you might expect. I can click on one particular one. I can use this menu down here to change the icon to something else and have them all be whatever I want. I can also resize the grid and have it, scrolling around however I want. So this is actually a list box. It's a list box subclass, if I remember right when we look at the code. But it is a list box, and it's kind of a neat use to get something that can be useful for applications. So take a looking at this. You can see right here, this is the list box that's been added to the window. And it is using the icon grid list box class that is down here. So it is a subclass of list box. And you can see here it's got a few custom methods and properties that are used to track things and for the positions of the icons and whatnot. But it's not implementing a whole heck of a lot of the event handlers. One thing I didn't show is that I believe I also have in here implemented is the use of the keyboard. No, maybe not. See what's in the key down event handler. I did implement some. Oh, I implemented for it not to work. There you go. But so you can see several of these are just returning true to say don't do anything. But it's essentially just trapping what gets clicked so it knows what to highlight. And then this particular one is drawing everything right here in the background paint event handler. So a neat little example that can show you how you can use a list box to do something like a grid. And that is made possible in conjunction with the fact that you can, of course, change your row height of the list box. So it doesn't have to be, skinny little rows like a list like you often see. I made a pretty large row height here so that I could fit a graphic image in there and kind of make more of cells that look more like squares, I can put more information in. So you got to remember that stuff is all adjustable. All right, so that's the icon grid. That's a fun little one. All right, let's move on to the property list. So this particular example shows you how you might use a list box to create something that looks like a property list. This, if you've been using Xojo in its previous versions, it may remind you of the property list in the old Real Studio application. And you can see here it has what looks like some headers here, some individual values with rows here that have a value next to them. I can click on the individual items. I could change the checkbox. I cannot click on the headers. I could click in there to change that. So you can see how that works a bit like property list box. Kind of neat. And again, you can see here this is implemented. There's a property list class here, which is just dragged onto the window. There's nothing else really here. And the property list class has on it an enumeration that's tracking the type of row that is being displayed in the list box. So it can be either header, general text, or checkbox. And you can implement this stuff however you want to do it, of course, setting some specific things here. And then tracking where you're clicking. So essentially here it's saying if you clicked on a header, then we're returning true, which means don't let that particular row be clicked. And then if we're clicking on a text, then we can set it to be editable. And there's more drawing here with colors to indicate the headers and other stuff. So there's not really a lot of code right here for that simple little property list box that you see there. And it certainly can be extended if you needed more capabilities, but it gives you a start to see how you can, again, take advantage of the various event handlers to make the list box do things that you might not otherwise expect. All right, related to this one is the source list control. Oh, and Dwayne had asked, let me just go back to Safari here. Dwayne had asked if I could bring up the URL with the examples that are available for download. And it's just on the standard videos page of the wiki that always contains the links to the recordings of these webinars and any example projects that are available. I'll leave it up there so it'll keep popping up in the background as I close Windows here. So the source list example, somewhat similar to the property list, but it does have a couple extra capabilities here. It's showing some icons. It has a hierarchical thing you can expand to show more information. I can click on the individual items within here. I can't click on the headers, however. And there's just some different ways that these are drawn so they look how you might expect a source list to look. So again, looking at this particular one, you can see there's a class here, source list, that is subclassing the list box control, and that's all that's just dragged onto the main window. Enumerations are also used again. Row types are very handy when you're adding rows to specify a type so that your event handlers will know what it's dealing with when it comes time to draw these things. And again, there's not a lot of event handlers on here. The painting is doing most of the work here to determine what type of row it's dealing with and then draw things accordingly, positioning icons and whatnot. And then there's some hard-coded stuff in here when you expand the inbox row to add a couple more specific inboxes with some icons. And this has actual methods that are on it here, so it's almost starting to add an API to this listbox subclass that can be used to add the individual items to it. So you can see there's adding a section, a parent, and an item, And if we find the code here on the window, you can see that it's adding the mailboxes section. It's adding a parent that's called inbox that has an icon, and then it's adding a section, another section that's called local, which results back in the display that we see here. These are sections, these is a parent, and these items are added automatically to that particular parent. All right, just checking my notes here, make sure I am hitting little high points in each one. All right, the next one we want to briefly take a look at is a hierarchical example. And this one is a file browser. And this just shows you the contents of your drive, or in my case, my multiple drives that are sitting in the Mac Pro. And I can expand things and see the folders that are in there and keep going all the way through that however I wanted. And it pulls in the specific information for the individual files and is displaying them. This is, again, using a subclass of ListBox here on the window. And let's find that right here. And the big thing this does is on the expand row, it is scanning the particular folder and then adding in all the stuff that's within it. And it's just chugging through here. So this is kind of an example of both folder item access and using a hierarchical list box. But you can see it's doing a little bit of special case stuff to determine how it displays sizes of files. And just chugging through. So the expand row event handler gets called each time a parent row that's in a hierarchical list box is expanded. So this stuff is lost when the row is closed, or you flip the switch to collapse the tree, if you will. So that's why this code runs each time the expand row happens, because it has to reload the information from the disk. Now, depending on what you're doing, this may be too slow or too expensive, so you may want to cache this sort of stuff. But you are going to generally have to, you're going to have to rebuild the rows in the list box each time it's expanded. All right. Oh yes, and this has some code here in the double-clicked event handler, so it will attempt to open whatever file you double-click in that particular viewer. And it just does that calling the launch method of the folder item. So if it's an executable, it'll run it. If it's a file of some kind, it'll attempt to open it in whatever file is associated with it. All right, I have one question here from Marcus. Looks kind of long. Let me see if I can scan it real quick. All right, Marcus is noting that it is often very helpful to use the row tag to store information in list boxes that you need behind the scenes, which I completely agree. Row tag is great. It lets you store pretty much any little snippets of information right along with each row. He notes that he often uses it to store something like a record ID for a database table or something like that. But if you're storing multiple pieces of information, how would you do that? As if you just store an ID in the row tag, well then the row tag is not available if you also have other information you want to store. And he's asking if a correct way to do that would be to maybe make a new class with all these particular properties and then put that class on the row ID. And absolutely, that would be a great way to do it, as long as the class makes some amount of sense for the type of information you're collecting, in that this information is somewhat related, I suppose. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want a class that just has a bunch of random properties that aren't related to each other, but they're likely going to be related to each other in the context of the list box. But certainly, creating a class is a great way to collect all your information in one place and then just assign that instance of the class to the row ID. It works fabulously. Or to the row tag, I mean. But that's definitely a great strategy. All right, list box. All right, now we're going to take a look at some more list box dragging. All right, so this example here is just going to display a list box and a little bit of a grid. And I can click on an individual item in here, and I can drag it around, and I can drop it on a different cell, and you can see the number gets moved there. And that's pretty much all this does, but this example actually came up by someone asking a question on the forum, was asking how to do this particular thing. So it seemed like a great example. So I threw this together. This is a pretty neat one. Because normally when you are dragging rows in the list box, the drag rectangle is the entire row. So you get kind of a long rectangle that drags around. Now in this particular case, we really only want to show that we're dragging the individual cell. So rather than it looking like we're dragging the entire row. And at first glance, it might not look like there's a way to do that. But it turns out that there kind of is. Because you can specify, rather than taking the default drag rectangle, you can specify your own picture by using the drag picture property of the drag item that's created when you start dragging rows around in your list box. So what I did is I created a new picture that is the entire width of the list box, but it's all blank except for the section in the middle that, or the section that overlays the particular row and column, or column, I guess, since we're already dealing with the row, that overlays the particular column that we're dealing with. So there's just a tiny little bit of math here that figures out what the current column is, and then it draws a little rectangle there with the number embedded in it using graphics. And then it in that picture, it gets assigned to the drag picture. So you can, if I run this again here, you can, I click on this. There's actually a picture that is as wide as this entire list box that was created, but it is blank except for the blue section here in the middle that lines up with the particular column that I pick. So it gives the illusion that I'm only dragging this particular cell around, even though behind the scenes, the entire row is what is causing the drag event to occur. So it's a neat little way to get behavior that more clearly matches what you're looking for. And this shows you how you can use the various drag event handlers to get the information you're looking for. The drag row is called when the dragging is started. The drop event, drop object is called when the object is dropped. And this is tracking what column and what row and column you're over as you're dragging around, so that we can figure out where things are going to get dropped. And that's pretty much all that's on there. There's not, again, not a whole heck of a lot of code in the event handlers, but the trick is using them in the right way to accomplish what you're trying to do. All right, let's look now at a grid example. Often people like to see if they can use a list box as a sort of spreadsheet or something. This particular example here shows you some of the ways you can do that. Here I'm using the arrow keys to move a single cell selection around. I can press enter, and then it goes into edit mode for the cell, and then I can type something in here. And I can continue to move around. I can enter it in one that has text so that I can edit the text. I can press Tab to move immediately to the next field in edit mode, so I can continue to type more text. And I could do that, and I have it set up so it goes to the next row when you reach the end of the line, and pressing Enter ends the editing. And you can continue to move the cursor around. It shows you the coordinates as you do that there. And of course, you could click on the individual cells as well. This particular list box here, it's not a subclass, it's just dragged right onto the window. I've turned on the grid lines to kind of give it more of a spreadsheet type look to it. And then, of course, this has a fair amount of event handlers here that look like they're implemented. Key down, of course, is handling all the key presses that are happening on the list box, and this is handling arrow keys. So you can see here there's a select case that's checking which particular key is pressed, so you can do what you want accordingly. There's a bunch of properties on here that are tracking the row and the column. And then the use of the arrow keys is just adjusting what the current row and column would be so that things are drawn appropriately using the event handlers for what the selected selected cell would be. This is just adding some initial rows to it. Double clicking will edit wherever the current position happens to be. If you're inside of a cell, you can also capture keys. So this particular one is checking for the tab key press and allowing it to move to the next cell, or if shift is held down, it'll move to the prior cell. And it's doing, checks in here to see if you're at the last column and then moving you to the new row, and if you're at the first column, moving you to the previous column, last row of the column, that sort of thing. Allowing editing, and then row highlighting is handled in the background paint event handler. So with this sort of thing, you could start to give people an actual grid where they could enter data. And sometimes it's a lot easier from a user interface standpoint for your users to enter data in this sort of spreadsheet type grid rather than forcing them to go through a bunch of fields or something like that. So this is how you can start to implement something down this path. All right. And let's see, I got another comment here. Lance is noting that the dragging example would be better if it swapped the values instead of replacing them. Huh. Maybe that would be better. I will leave that as an exercise. Should be very easy to make that change to the code for it to swap, because you have the value that's being dragged around and you have the column you're dropping it onto. So you should be able to get the value of the column you're dropping onto and save that so that you can swap it back. Should be a pretty easy change. Feel free to go ahead and make that change and then shoot me code and I can take a look at it for you. But that's a good suggestion. Thank you, Lance. All right, which one are we up to here? All right, the last desktop one we want to look at here is show an example of using an extension method. Now, what we've been doing so far on all of these is dealing with, hang on a second, I can't talk and read at the same time, so I need to find my example. Here it is. All right, now I can keep talking. So I've been primarily just adding list boxes to a window or subclassing them to add the functionality. But you can also use the extends feature of Xojo to add methods to the list box without actually doing anything to a list box, without having to subclass it or do anything to it on the window. So you can see here, this particular list box is just a plain old list box with some default data added to it of the teams in the American League for Major League Baseball. And right down here, I have a module, and in it, I have a method that is called export. And this method is what's called an extension method. And it is, as you can see right here in the parameters, it is extending the list box. And it takes in a parameter, which is a file. That's just a folder item. And what it's going to do is it's going to output the data in the list box into this file. And it's just going to create a text file. This particular thing is just looping through and creating a tab delimited file. You could certainly output it however you wanted using the same kind of technique. Comma delimited would probably be a little bit more sophisticated because you have to handle where the commas are positioned, but you could, format it however you wanted your text file to be formatted using something like this. So this little method just creates a file and then outputs the data to it that's in the list box. And its usage, if I go to the source code here, it works as if it's an actual method on the list box, even though it's not part of the list box framework code that comes with Xojo, and it's not part of a subclass. But it acts as if it is. So you can see here we just get a file that we want to output to, and then use the name of the list box, call the export method, and then pass in the file. And we can just save this here. And we now have a tab delimited text file that was saved to disk. So that particular strategy is a neat way to add some features to ListBox without having to go through all the work of subclassing it. It's a great little thing for specific features like this, like export. I've seen things like this where you can create a extension method that maybe you could give it a database connection and a table name, and it could select the data from the database for you and display it in the list box. And that's pretty neat, very handy. So you can do stuff like that. So definitely, if you're not taking advantage of extension methods in general in Xojo, you definitely should do so. They work obviously with anything, not just ListBox, but ListBox is a common case where they are used. All right. My little chart here says it's time to run our polls. So let me switch over and do that. So I'm going to run, I got 4 polls here we're going to run for our attendees. If you're watching this recording later, I'll read the questions. Feel free to shoot me emails on any of these poll topics if you have an opinion. So our first poll is, what type of apps do you primarily create with Xojo, desktop or web? All right, let's see here. I'll let the polls each go for about 30 seconds or so, and then I'll close them. All right, let's see, close this poll. And we'll move on to the next one. Our next poll is simple yes or no. Do you have a Xojo Pro license? That's just a yes or no question. And if you're not aware, Xojo Pro is our license that gives you everything that's included with Xojo, the ability to create desktop and web and console applications, connect to databases. Pretty much it's the kitchen sink license. You get everything. And you also get an additional installation, so you can have your license activated on 3 systems instead of 2. All right, let's move on to our next question. How long have you been using Xojo? A few different choices here. Always curious. Xojo's been around actually since 1998 at our XDC conference. We actually recognized a few people that were at the conference that have been Xojo users since version 1. I myself have only been using Xojo in its prior versions since 2001 or so, about when the OS 10 version came out. All right, and let's move on to our last poll here. And this one is, how do you use Xojo? And the choices here, like you do consulting or sell apps or create your own apps, or you're just learning. And if you do or don't yet do consulting, I am doing a webinar, I believe it's in July, on consulting using Xojo, and hopefully be able to provide everyone some tips and techniques for those looking to get into that sort of thing, or for those that already do it and maybe want to try and grab some advice. All right, I think that about does it for the polls. Thanks, everyone. All right, so then I've got a few web examples I want to show you here. So let's close this one here. So we'll start with just a very simple one. Now the web list box, for what it does, works very similarly to the desktop one, but it's not nearly as comprehensive. It has fewer features and does fewer things, but you can use it in a few neat ways. So in general, this is how it works. This very simple example here is just going to let you add data to a list box. Nothing fancy at all. Mostly to demonstrate that this technique works the same as it would with a desktop list box. You can see I can click on individual items and update them. And the web list box does allow you to multi-select by using the keys on the keyboard. I think holding down Control to select both of those rows. So again, nothing terribly sophisticated there. You can see that by looking at the source code. The add button is very simple. Just adding the row and then clearing the text fields if it's a new row, and if it's not a new row, it's updating the existing selected information. And then again, this has an event handler that can tell you when different rows have been selected in the list box, and you can use that to update the particular fields. All right, so let's see here. Before I jump back into a couple other of the web examples, I see a couple questions have queued up here, so let me just jump over to the beginning. All right, if you have Marcus is asking, if you have a list box which you're populating from a database, again, Marcus's questions are so long, it takes me a while to read them. Sorry. Well, he seems to be asking about sorting in relation to if you're only loading up visible rows. I'm not exactly sure I'm getting the gist of that question here in the little field that I have to read with here. Certainly, if you're only sorting visible stuff, I mean, you can't do a full sort unless you have access to all the data. So you're probably going to have to request everything from the database sorted and then pull out the subsection you want to display. Or you can, of course, save everything in one of the behind-the-scenes tag fields, a row tag or a cell tag, and then use that for sorting. That definitely works as well. But you generally, when you're sorting, you're going to need access to all the information. And then a couple of questions on survey here. Looks like Pierre Guy is asking if there's an update from desktop to pro. I believe there is, but you do have to contact customer service so they can put together a quote, because they prorate pricing and whatnot on that, so it's not a default option on the store. But definitely, if you're interested in going from desktop or web or any of the other licenses to a Xojo Pro license, email customer service, and they can certainly help you out with that and get you a specific quote so you know what that would cost. The customer service email, I'll just type it up here in the browser, is custserve at xojo.com. All right, the next example I want to show here is going to show how to do a web list box that you can sort. Now on the desktop list box, you have built-in sorting in the headers, and you have the compare rows event handler that you can use to sort information. But those are not available on the web list box. So to sort, you essentially have to reload your information and then or sort your information and then repopulate the list box with the newly sorted information. Here you can see that I am clicking on the header though to initiate a sort, and then when I move over the header, a style gets changed. That's a new property in Xojo 2014 release 1 that allows you to set a style for the header. And we can look at the code in a moment, but essentially as I'm clicking here, there's also an event handler that lets me know I clicked on a header. I am sorting the information behind the scenes and then essentially deleting the data that's in the list box and reloading it in the newly sorted order. So you can see right here, clicking on the header just toggles the sort order, ascending or descending, and then calls a load rows method. Which just reloads the data. So not quite as flexible as the desktop version, but it certainly can work perfectly fine as long as you don't have a ton of data that you're loading into the desktop, into the web list box. But that brings up a couple points related to the next couple examples. All right, so the next one I want to show you here is a lazy loading list box. Is that the one that's on my list? No, sorry, it's the web large data list box. So let's do that one here. So this particular example here is going to load up a bunch of pretend data behind the scenes using a thread and update a progress bar as the data gets loaded. So you can see the row count continue to update here, and the thread is progressing along. I can interact with the list box as new rows are being added to it because it's getting loaded via a thread. And this can be one way to populate your list box if you have a big chunk of data that might hold up the app for some reason or another. Now, I'm going to probably suggest in most cases you're not going to want to show 2,000 rows in a web application list box, or really probably in any list box for that matter. That's an awful lot of rows for the user to have to digest. But if you do have a specific need for that, this is one technique you can use to populate that. But this sort of thing, if you do go with a UI design like this, you're going to want to make it easy for users to find stuff. Probably have a search field of some kind so that they're not having to scroll through an entire list to find the particular thing they're looking at. And do keep in mind when you're doing this sort of thing with a web application, all of this information, whether it's sent all at once down to the browser or in little pieces using a thread, is eventually all going to need to be sent to the browser. So that's a fair amount of data that the browser's going to need to manage. Could use significant browser memory depending on what you're actually showing. All right. So essentially here the load button is just starting a thread that is, get the right thread that I open up here. It is just adding a bunch of data to the list box. And actually it's probably adding it to the array, and then this timer is then grabbing information that was added via the thread and then throwing it into the list box. So that particular technique, there's probably a few specific cases where this is useful. In general, I'm probably not going to recommend it most of the time. I'm going to recommend you show smaller amounts of data, which flows into our next example, which is the lazy loading one, which let me find here. Now, this is a more typical type of thing that you can see in a web application where you only show the user a small amount of data at a time and you let them essentially page through it. So here it's showing 10 rows, and then I can use the next button to get the next group, or I can go back and forth, jump to the beginning, that sort of thing. Now this is handy for a couple reasons, because it's never getting more than 10 rows at a time, so this information isn't being retained in memory. Fetching 10 rows from a database is almost always very, very quick. So it's fast, and it's a particular kind of a familiar interface that people are used to, so there's also that. And this takes advantage of a couple neat features. This is connecting to a SQLite database. To pull in just the particular chunk you're looking at. So you can see right here this select statement here, and again, this is a SQLite select statement. There's two keywords that are in here, the limit keyword and the offset keyword. And the limit keyword is essentially how many rows do you want to pull back at one time. And this is always using 10, which is set up as a constant here. So this select statement will always limit the results to 10 rows. And then in conjunction with the offset keyword, it's telling you where do you want to start. So offset normally is going to start at 0, and it'll get the first 10 rows that way. But when you get to page 2, you can start the offset at 10 and then get the next 10 rows. And you don't have to like grab the whole result set into memory and then chunk it up yourself or anything like that. You can just tell the database, hey, give me this specific slice of data that I'm looking for. Very fast and efficient. I'm just going to set a little breakpoint here when we run it so you can see what the select statement actually looks like. We'll let, all right, so we'll do a page 2 one here. So you can see this particular one, it's limit 10, offset 10. That gets us page 2 of the data. Not all databases work exactly this way. This is that syntax is specific to SQLite. I'm certain other databases have equivalent syntax. I don't know what it would be off the top of my head, but that's certainly something you want to check into when you're implementing this particular type of design. All right. So that's the lazy loading list box, and that technique means that's a general computer term. And lazy loading means it only loads what it needs when it needs it. It doesn't load everything all up at once. All right, let's go. I want a couple other things to show. So that's all the examples I have here. Remind everyone here that you can grab these examples right here from the videos page in the wiki. In the next day or so, this will also be updated with the link for the recording of this webinar, but you can now go in there and grab the examples, play around with them, do what you want. And I expect most of these examples, if not all of them, will also be in the next release of Xojo itself, so that they'll always be easily accessible. And I also want to point people out to a few different third-party ListBox controls that are available on our third-party products page. Actually, I didn't want to search that way. I want to search this way. All right. So here in the UI component section, we've got 4 that are highlighted immediately. Mac Technologies Consulting has the data on demand list box, which is essentially a type of lazy loading list box that will only load in the information that's actually displayed. And when it goes off screen, from what I understand, that no longer has to be managed by the ListBox. So it's pretty speedy for dealing with large amounts of data, and might be something you want to check into if you need that capability. ListBox Extras by Ben Software. I haven't looked at in a while, but I believe that adds some things like printing and other little features that you might otherwise find useful and won't have to implement yourself. Merge Cells ListBox is pretty neat. It gives you some ability, like it might say, to combine cells in a ListBox to make them act like they're one bigger cell. Kind of a neat little ListBox subclass. And Jeremy Leroy has a property ListBox that's a much more sophisticated version of the simple thing that I showed you. So you definitely want to check that out. And then also on here, if I can find that link, the Studio Stable graphics package includes a bunch of graphics related things, but it also includes, and this isn't specifically a ListBox subclass like the other ones are, but it includes a canvas control that can behave as a ListBox. Or actually, I should say a ListBox that's based on a canvas control. So it has some features that the standard ListBox doesn't have. So you definitely might want to check that out and see if that has something that might be helpful to you. And then other one on here, also not a ListBox subclass, is the Style Grid by Einhuger, which is a plugin that is kind of an alternative ListBox, if you will, that has different features. You can have different columns and heights, I believe, and you have different control over the cells, and it's pretty speedy. So that's another ListBox that can be available to you if you need that sort of thing in your applications. All right, so that covers everything I wanted to cover here on Good Guy ListBox today. Next week's webinar is our very first guest webinar, and Jared Zellick of Quick Start Software is going to talk about design patterns. And I've seen this session before. It's pretty cool. So if you have any interest at all in design patterns and how they can help simplify your software, you definitely want to tune in next week. And of course, lots more webinars coming up. Be sure to register to reserve your spot. And the recording for this webinar will be available definitely this week, in the next day or so. So be sure to check out there. You can go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to always be notified when new videos are uploaded. And of course, on the video page as well, which is here, you can also find the RSS feed for the YouTube channel that you can subscribe to in your favorite RSS reader if you use those sort of things. All right, I want to thank everyone for attending this week's webinar. Have a great rest of your day.